Hello, I'm Andrew and welcome to the first instructional video on my channel. I'm going to share with you three basic opening principles and also talk about the three basic elements of chess. And if you understand these opening principles and these elements by the end of this video, then you're going to be able to find yourself, no matter what your opponent plays against you, in a solid position out of the opening and ready to tackle the middle game. So let's just say you've learned how the pieces move in a game of chess. You know how the pawns can move 2 squares on their first go, or 1, and the knights move in an L shape like this, and you find yourself with white in the starting position, and you realize, well, hang on a minute, I've got 8 pawns that can each move to 2 possible squares, and I have 2 knights that can each move to 2 possible squares. All of a sudden, I've got 20 possibilities, and I'm feeling very overwhelmed. Well, chess is a very overwhelming game. By move 5, there are 5 million possible positions, or 5 million possible sequences that can reach those positions, and it is estimated that the total possible number of chess games outnumbers the number of known atoms in the universe. So it's incredibly complicated. But that does not mean every possible move is a valid move, or an equally valid move, a move that works as good as, say, another one. If we are in this starting position as white, it might surprise you to know, you might already know this, but it might surprise you to know that 2 moves in this position account for the overwhelming majority of chess games in the Lichess database, and in fact, any database. Those moves are pawn to e4 and pawn to d4. So why is pawn e4 or pawn d4 stronger than any of our other possible moves? Well, this brings me to the first opening principle, which is to control the center. And by the center, I'm referring to these 4 squares in the middle here, d4, e4, e5, and d5. Now, when we advance a pawn, like, say, e4 to e4, we're doing exactly that. One of our pawns occupies one of these central 4 squares, and we are also attacking another one of those central squares. Notice we're also looking after f5, which is good. But these 4 squares are of the utmost importance in the opening stages of the game. It was Bobby Fischer, the first American world champion of chess, who said that tactics flow from good positions. Essentially, what he meant was that if we can arrive at a good position, then we are going to be able to overwhelm our opponent because we will have control of the most important squares. We will be able to find the killer tactic that reduces the game to a position where we have an obvious advantage. d4 does exactly the same. We are occupying one of the central 4 squares and attacking the other. But today, we are going to focus on e4 because I think all beginners should start with this opening. The reason for that is it tends to lead to more open positions that are rich with potential tactics, and I think beginners should be putting themselves in those kinds of positions in order to train their tactical vision. So let's look at e4. We are controlling the center. By far, the most common response to this is e5. And what that does is simply mirror white, occupying one of the central 4 squares, and it also prevents this d4 push. Why does it prevent a d4 push? I can play d4, and after my opponent captures my pawn, and I capture back, isn't everything equal? Well, this brings me to the basic elements of chess. There are 3 basic elements I want you to try and keep in mind, and those are matter, space, and time. What do I mean by each? Well, by matter, I'm referring to the pieces and their numerical value. So every piece of material that we have has a numerical value attached to it. So pawns are worth 1, knights and bishops are worth 3, rooks are worth 5, queens 9, and kings infinite, because if you lose the king, you lose the game. So although this is an equal material exchange, 1 for 1, black has lost their e5 pawn that took our pawn on d4, and we have recaptured with our queen. That's 1 for 1. But our opponent can now develop their knight to c6, kicking our queen away. We have to move this queen, otherwise we would lose it. And if we were to lose a piece with a value of 9 for a piece worth only 3, that would be very tragic indeed. So we want to move this piece out of the way. Let's say we retreat back to d1. Well, we've lost time here. Chess is a turn-based game, and black was able to develop one of their pieces and force us to make a move we otherwise wouldn't have wanted to play. We would have liked to have spent our move developing one of our other pieces, because the second opening principle is to develop your pieces smoothly. Well, this is not a smooth development of pieces. By playing d4 and allowing our opponent to capture here, capturing back with our queen and being kicked and losing time, that's not a smooth development of pieces. We are passing the turn back to black, where they're now going to be able to develop one of their other minor pieces. And if they get a lead in development, they're going to be controlling more space. And remember, if they control more space, they'll have a better position, and tactics flow from good position. So we don't want to allow our opponent a better position than us if it can be prevented. So what does that mean? After e4, e5, we're going to have to play something else. So we should concentrate on developing one of our minor pieces. Now, by our minor pieces, I'm referring to our knights and our bishops. Generally, we want to develop our knights before our bishops, and that, again, has something to do with the principle of time. The reason for that is just knights are a little bit slower to react on the board, because a bishop can zip to the other side of the board in 2 moves if everything was clear. A knight is a little bit clunkier. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's only 1 extra move, but sometimes that counts for quite a lot. So because knights are the slower piece, we want to get them into the game first. We have 2 of those. We have a knight on b1, we have a knight on g1. Where do they want to go? A lot of beginners will play their pieces to the edge of the board, like this. But I want to rule out these moves now. I don't want you to be playing these moves. We're going to understand why these are weak. Again, it has to do with one of the basic elements, this time space, the space that we control. If I have a knight on a3, let's look at the squares that my knight controls. It controls b5, it controls c4, it controls c2, and it controls b1. That's 4 squares. Now, if my opponent develops their knight to f6, let's look at the number of squares this knight controls. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 squares for only 4. My opponent's knight on f6 is effectively twice as strong as my knight on a3. And that's all because my opponent followed the first opening principle, which is control the center. And what that means for our minor pieces then is that they want to be gravitating towards the center as they develop and not towards the edge. An easy way to remember this as being a bad maneuver is the saying, knights on the rim is dim. So then we have knight c3 as a possibility and knight f3 as a possibility. Both of these moves are perfectly playable. Knight c3 leads to an opening referred to as the Vienna. This is actually what I play, and there are many reasons to prefer knight c3 over knight f3. However, at the beginner level, I would advise knight f3, and the reason for that is we need to understand that chess is a game of question and answer. I make a move, you respond to it. All right? So when I play knight c3, I'm defending my pawn on e4, but I'm not really asking any serious, significant question from black. But when I develop my knight to f3, I'm not defending my pawn on e4, I'm actually attacking my opponent's pawn on e5, which is asking an immediate question. Black is going to have to respond to this, or they're going to lose the pawn, so they're going to have to defend it in some way. Another thing to keep in mind is that because we move first as white in a game of chess, we are the more aggressive side, or at least we have the capacity to be more aggressive, and so typically we want to follow that impulse. We want to dictate the flow of traffic in the game, and we want to be the first to ask those questions. And when we play knight c3, as I say, we're just defending our e4 pawn. We're not asking that immediate question of what are you going to do about this weakness here. So that's why, for beginners, I would recommend knight f3. Okay, so black can defend this square now in numerous ways. They could play f6. They could play bishop d6. They could play d6. They could play knight c6. They could play queen e7, queen f6. They could play queen g5. That would lose the queen, but they could play it. We're going to look at why only 2 of these moves follow the opening principles and are good, and why the rest are bad. Firstly, let's look at f6 and understand something about the pawns at the very start of the game. All of my pawns on their starting square are protected by either the queen, the king, and or a minor piece, with the exception of the f-pawn. So on both sides, f2 and f7 are only protected by the king. That makes them incredibly soft spots indeed. The fastest game of chess would go f3, something like e6, g4, and now queen h4. That's actually checkmate. The king is in check. This piece cannot be removed. We have no piece to block the check on either of these two squares, and so the king would have to move, but the king can't move without remaining in check, and so that's checkmate. You've lost the game in 2 moves, all because you created a weakness by advancing your f-pawn. So if we go back to the position we were just looking at, e4, e5, knight f3, this pawn's being attacked. If you do this, this weakness opens up, and if I'm able to start slotting my pieces in on h5 and attacking your king, you might have to play g6, and your entire kingside pawn structure is loosening up, meaning that you're not going to be able to castle quickly kingside. And what is our third opening principle? Castle quickly. Get our king to safety. So we don't want to be advancing our f-pawn if we can help it. There are, of course, some exceptions to this rule, but this particular position is not an exception. Don't, in this position, play f6. It is far too weakening. So let's have a look at some of the other options. Bishop d6. Well, here, black's bishop actually acts more as a hindrance than a help. Yes, it is supporting the e5 pawn, but it also blocks the advancement of this d pawn, meaning if we ever want to move this d pawn, we're going to have to play something like this, and tuck this bishop in, and then advance the d pawn, and this just simply takes too much time. Our opponent, white, is going to be able to achieve too much in the time it takes us to solve this awkwardness. There's no need for the bishop to be here defending e5. The bishop would much rather come to a square like c5, or, I don't know, pinning a piece from b4, pinning maybe the knight on c3. The bishop is better placed than this. We can achieve this job much more smoothly with d6. d6 is actually one of the 2 acceptable moves in this position. The same is true for queen e7 and queen f6. This is kind of violating another opening principle that I haven't listed as one of the 3 key ones, but it's kind of an addendum to the second principle, which is that we want to develop our pieces smoothly. That typically means knights before bishops, then we castle, and then and only then do we look to get our rooks and our queen in the game. We don't want to develop our queen too early when there's a lot going on in the center of the board, and she could come under some easy attack, because if she comes under attack, we're going to have to move her, and we lose time. So we don't want to be doing that. Also, in this position, again, she is blocking the development of the dark squared bishop, so the bishop would have to come out this way. And it's not going to be very good on g7, given the fact that it's going to be blocked by its own pawn on e5. It would much rather have the entire diagonal here, and as long as we have a pawn stationed on e5, that's not going to happen. So these queen moves don't really work either. So if not f6, and if not bishop d6, and if not these queen moves, then it's d6. d6 is one move, and the other move, this is actually the best move, is knight c6. Knight c6 maintains a degree of flexibility that d6 loses, because when we play knight c6, let's say white plays a move like bishop c4, well, this bishop can come out to c5, or it can move to e7, whereas when we play d6, after a move like bishop c4, this bishop is restricted to e7 and e7 only. This is what we call a pawn chain, where one pawn protects its neighbor and the other protects its other neighbor. This is a very good, solid structure. We can talk more about pawn chains in a future video, but one thing that I would stress here in the opening stage of the game is that typically you want your bishop to be on the outside, not stuck on the inside of the pawn chain. So if d6, bishop c4, this bishop, say it's coming to e7, it's stuck on the inside of the pawn chain, whereas white's bishop is on the outside of the pawn chain. It's not stuck here on e2, restricted only to this diagonal. It has the much longer, much nicer diagonal here, which controls more, you've got it, space. d6 is a playable opening. It is the Philidor defense. If you play d6, you haven't by any means lost the game. But just understand that it's slightly less flexible than the slightly better knight c6. And from here, white now wants to develop their last minor piece that they are required to develop before they can castle. And that is their light squared bishop on f1. So where does the bishop want to come to? Well, there is f2, there is d3, there is c4, b5, and a6. We can rule out a6, and we can rule out d3 as terrible moves. The reason is, a6, you simply lose the bishop like this. We wouldn't want to be doing that. And d3, same problem as when the black bishop tries to defend the pawn by coming to d6. We block the advancement of our d pawn, which is going to cost us greatly in time later on. We don't want to be doing that. So then that leaves c4, b5, and e2. Now, c4 and b5 are the best, and e2 is okay. Again, you've not lost the game if you play e2, but e2 is passive. Again, we are white, we are the aggressor, we want to ask questions of our opponent. This doesn't ask any significant question. It defends our knight on f3. But is our knight even being attacked? No. And regardless, even were it being attacked, it is already defended twice by our pawn on g2 and our queen on d1. They look after this knight very nicely. So bishop e2 is just a little bit too passive. Let's get out into the game. Let's get outside of what will likely become our eventual pawn chain and start asking some questions of black. So how does c4 or b5 ask a question? Bishop c4 attacks f7, which is a soft spot in the black position. Let's say black just develops their knight now to f6. We can play knight g5 and go after this immediately with two of our minor pieces. This is very difficult to defend against as black unless you know what you're doing. You can't just kick the knight. I'm coming in here and winning the pawn. The knight can't be captured. It's protected by the bishop. I'm hitting your queen. I'm hitting your rook. The queen would have to move, and you've just lost a rook. Very, very dangerous indeed. So bishop c4, attacking this square immediately, could cause black a lot of problems if they're not careful and if they don't know what they're doing. And bishop b5, of course, asks another immediate question. I'm attacking your knight right now. What are you going to do about this? Are you going to chase my bishop and make a trade like this? Or are you going to chase my bishop, and if I drop back, you're going to chase my bishop again? And then I'm dropping back here and I'm attacking f7 again? We're asking questions, whereas bishop e2 doesn't really do that. Let's go with bishop c4 because, again, this is what I teach to beginners because it's the most principled. Bishop b5 is perfectly playable. It's the Spanish opening as opposed to bishop c4, which is known as the Italian opening. You'll quickly realize that lots of openings have names to help us remember them, and more often than not, they are either named after the place where they first became popular or after a person that contributed to the development of the theory in that particular line. As an example, bishop b5 here is referred to as the Spanish because it was popularized in Spain, and it's also sometimes referred to as the Ruy Lopez because that was the name of the Spanish practitioner that developed a lot of the theory in this line. But because bishop b5 leads to far more complicated positions, and because bishop c4 leads to slightly simpler positions, I will be teaching you the Italian today, which is bishop c4. Now, what is more important to me than you remembering the names of the opening or the exact placement of every piece, memorizing every move as a sequence of moves without the intent behind it? What's more important than that is you understand the intent. So far, every move that has been played on the board has in some way followed one of the fundamental principles or has demonstrated an understanding for one of the three basic elements of chess: material, time, and space. Let's have a look. e4. We control the center. Our opponent does the same. We develop a piece, one of our knights before our bishops, asking a question of black. Black defends while developing a piece. We create another threat. Now we're ready to castle. Now, it's very simple when I put it like that, but there are a plethora of other avenues that we could have taken by this point. So what happens from here? Well, we already looked at this knight f6 idea where we can go after this pawn immediately. Now, this is playable as black. I actually like to play this in response to the Italian as black because it gets very messy and very complicated very quickly, and you really have to know what you're doing, and it leads to lots of sharp, exciting tactical lines. But I would not teach that to beginners. If your opponent plays knight f6 as white, feel free to do this if you dare, and maybe we'll cover this in an openings video on the Italian, but you can also just play d3. What are you doing? You're solidifying your pawn chain. You're allowing the bishop to flow to a good square. You are looking after the pawn that black was attacking, and you are preparing to castle. We have nearly got to the point where we have castled our king, which is good. King safety is of the utmost importance, which is why it is third on the opening principles. But what if our opponent just responds bishop c5? Well, same thing, we can just play d3. And we're solidifying our pawn structure, and after our opponent develops their knight with something like knight f6, we could castle now, but we could also just develop our bishop, pinning our opponent's knight to the queen. This is an aggressive tactic, whereby now if my opponent's knight were ever to move, they would be hanging the queen. This is known as a relative pin, where the piece, my bishop, x-rays the queen through the knight, so that if the knight moves, I win a piece of very high material value, which is relatively a lot higher, being that it's worth 9, than the value of my bishop, being that the value of my bishop is worth 3. That's a relative pin. Now, if you can imagine that instead of the queen being on d8, it were the king on d8, well, then that would be called an absolute pin. The knight would not be able to move, because were it to move, my bishop would be seeing the king on d8. Again, we're imagining the king's on d8, not the queen, which is illegal, because black can't make a move that would actually put their king in check. So that's the difference between a relative pin and an absolute pin. From here, it is likely that black would either castle themselves or solidify their pawn chain. Let's say they do that. They are now freeing up their light squared bishop to come to a good square, where they might now be pinning our knight to our queen, and after castles, castles. And now already we are starting to move out of the opening stage of the game towards the middle game, getting the very last of our pieces into the game. A beginner might play something like knight c3, developing their last piece, bishop g4, and only now would we look to step our queen off the back rank, centralize our rooks, and we are good to go, good to start attacking. So let's have a look very briefly at something else. We can't expect that after we play e4, our opponent is always going to play e5, or that after we play knight f3, they're always going to play knight c6. What if they play bishop c5? Well, we just follow the same opening principles. Get our pieces developed, you know? Make a threat, prepare to castle, get our bishop on the outside of the pawn chain. Our opponent will castle. It's likely that we could actually transpose into the same thing. By transpose, I just mean we reach the same position via a slightly different move order. I mean, were our opponent now just to play knight f6, and we were to play here, and then they were to castle, and we were to castle, and then they were to play this, we've just reached the same position via a different move order. What if we play e4 and they play c6? Well, we couldn't play d4 after they played e5, because after captures, they develop a knight to c6, attacking our queen, and we have to move that back. But they're not controlling d4, so we can just play d4 here. And they're going to likely want to control the center with d5, which is why they played c6 in the first place. This is called the Caro-Kann when black plays this way, c6 and then d5. Here, we just follow opening principles. Either we exchange, and we just want to look after our pieces and control the center and develop our knights and, you know, make sure everything's protected and get our bishop onto some good squares and castle. Or we advance the pawn. We've got another central square under our control here, and we're controlling now a lot of space on our opponent's 6th rank, which is very nice. And if our opponent develops like this, you know, we're just looking to get our pieces onto good squares, get castled, develop our pieces sensibly, and, you know, make sure that we're checking that everything is defended. And so it doesn't even matter if your opponent plays c5 against e4. You will understand why they have played this move. They're controlling a central square, and if we play d4, this, you know that they likely want something like this, chasing our queen away, and we've lost time. And notice how they've managed to trade off one of their wing pawns for one of our central pawns, meaning they are going to be able to take the center much more easily than us if we play this way. So that can't be the right way to play. So how else do we play? Well, we don't take the center immediately, we just look after our pieces. And maybe soon we'll make a d4 break, when we can take back with our knight and not our queen, and everything will be okay. So it doesn't matter what your opponent throws at you if you are following these opening principles. Control the center, develop your pieces smoothly, and castle quickly, with an eye on the basic elements of chess, which is an understanding of matter, time, and space, and how it relates to whether or not a move is good or not. We can look at that in a further video in a little bit more detail. If you keep your eye on these details, you can't go wrong. You will find yourself in a solid position out of the opening, ready to explore the very dense and equally, if not more complicated, middle game. The best of luck with your openings. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments what you'd maybe like to see in terms of instructional videos in future. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Take care.